As I said at the beginning of our service, it's been a very busy week. One Prime Minister out, one Prime Minister in, one monarch out, one monarch in. It was always said of Queen Victoria that she was determined to outlive her heir, Bertie the Bounder. That's not true of our Queen, and I'm sure of that. But if she was hanging on to see the back of Boris Johnson, I can quite understand that. If there has ever been a bigger dichotomy between the example of the monarch, of duty, of perseverance and of probity, and her Prime Minister, there's none that I can think of in our lifetime. You would have to go back to the time of Gladstone, Queen Victoria, for that. Ecclesiastes was our reading. And verses 1 and 2, I draw your attention to. There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born, and a time to die. A time to be born, and a time to die. Our Queen, born 1926, died 1922. On the throne for 70 years. Very great times of change. 1952, there was still rationing. 2022, maybe there will have to be again. We are no longer Elizabethans. Suddenly, theoretically, we're Carolingians. It's only when I look at our government that I have this irreverent thought that we are now a bunch of Charlies. Looking back over the reign of our Queen. This is a photo, of course, from when she was still Princess Elizabeth. This is from her time in 1945 in the ATS as a mechanic. And I was interested to hear recently one little thing I didn't know. I did know that Princess Elizabeth then had a great deal of trouble persuading her father, King George of course, that she should be allowed to go into the services. It was a tradition that the heir to the throne went to the services, but this is the first time the heir to the throne was a woman. But she was allowed eventually, and there was an official state visit to see the princess at work on a Bedford 1500 weight truck, and the king came past and saw her working on the mechanics, and then went away and did the glad handing with some other people, and came back and said, "Haven't you fixed it yet?" That is fathers for you, isn't it? I'm one of them too, so I know. Over the course of a very long reign, Elizabeth the Queen has performed her duties in an exemplary fashion. Here she is, back in 1952. I mentioned it's still rationing, that's why it's black and white, see, it didn't have any colour from it. Verse 3, a time to tear down and a time to build. This was a time to build. but throughout her reign, the tearing down bit, the getting rid of the unnecessary pomp and circumstance was part of her duties, and which she took very seriously. Verse 5. A time to scatter stones and a time to gather them. Over the course of her reign, she has got rid of much of the flummery, got rid of much of the ceremonial, kept the essential, and moved the monarchy ahead. As an old Republican, I quite regret the fact that our Queen was quite so intelligent. She was very intelligent and duty-focused. If some of our previous monarchs had been on the throne in that time, we wouldn't have a monarchy anymore, but no, we still do. Verse 7. A time to tear and a time to mend. Well, our Queen has done plenty of mending over the years. She's had to do that with her own family. She had to do that as Britain ceased to be an empire and became a commonwealth. And she's done the duty of a head of state with so many different other heads of state in exemplary fashion. There was a time to be silent and a time to speak. The monarch rarely gets to speak. But she did maintain an exemplary silence. My earliest memories of our Queen are really the state occasions, like the Trooping of the Colour here, which I was taken to see in 1900 and frozen to death, sometime in the 60s. And this is about that time. And our Queen loved her horses. And it's a passing of an age. But Ecclesiastes verse 4 reminds us that there is a time to weep and a time to laugh. And towards the end of her reign, our Queen managed to show us something of her own personal sense of humour, didn't she? It wasn't always, that's a bit down, isn't it? It wasn't always opening bridges, sending ships off down the slipway, and as you can see from this face, some of it was a bit tiresome, wasn't it? But she's got all through that, and we've left the time of weeping behind, and 2012, my first one here, do you remember the opening of the Olympics? And that marvellous joke that they played where it looked like the Queen had parachuted out of the helicopter. When they started on the TV, I thought they'd found a lookalike. Until she spoke. Then I realised. So there she is, with command of ball. And right at the end of her, have you seen this one? Paddington Bear visiting the Queen at the Jubilee. So we eventually, for 70 years, we have wondered what the Queen kept in her handbag. And now we know it's a marmalade sandwich. Plain spoons. I have, as I say, I'm not Republican, but I have a personal admiration for our Queen. She was the slave of duty. That's a phrase from W.S. Gilbert, referring to Frederick, who was accidentally, due to the fact his nursemaid was a bit hard of hearing, apprenticed to a pilot instead of a pilot. But he later finds out he wants to leave the pirates, but he finds out that he was born on leap year on February the 29th, so he's not going to be able to leave them until his 21st birthday, when he'll be 84. Well, none of that contrivance with our Queen, but she was still the slave of duty. Duty before everything. My personal admiration doesn't end there. She was a deeply Christian woman. And that was always at the forefront of her thoughts as well. And the Lord did see fit to send trials and tribulations to our Queen on a personal level, but she's always risen above them. Now I want to bring us on to the other big event of the week, and I'm not talking about the accession of the new monarch now. I'm talking about a new Prime Minister and a new government. Duty first. Our Queen cannot have been feeling very well, but she made sure that she was there to shake the hand of Boris Johnson as he left office, and the hand of Liz Truss as she took office about 24 hours before she died. It's an irreverent thought of mine that possibly when she was shaking Boris Johnson's hand goodbye, that may have been a smart moment, but who knows. Now I want to take us to our new government and look at Ecclesiastes again. A time to search and a time to give up. Now is a time to search. A time to gather up and a time to throw away. This is a time to to mend and not to tear. This is a time to embrace and not to refrain from embracing. We need our government to embrace new ideas. We need our government to embrace new ways of doing things. We need them not to scatter stones, but to gather them. We need to come together. We need to come together to solve the problems that our nation is facing. Otherwise, people in this country, in 2022, in the 21st century, are going to go hungry, they're going to go cold, and some of them are going to die. We need to come together. We need a government that will lead. Of course, our plans and our government's plans are not God's plans. God's plans are ineffable. It means we can't understand them. But God's plan, and there is a plan for our nation, will come to pass. And we better make sure that our plans fit in with that. In verse 14, it says that sorry, turn 2 pages over at once. Verse 14 says, I know that everything that God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it, and nothing can be taken from it. God does it so that the people will fear them. Throughout the Old Testament and the New, it refers to the fear of God, and that is not oogie woogie, I'm frightening, that sort of fear. It's not that at all. It means respect. Respect for God's laws. And if we respect God's laws, we will do God's will. We as a nation should take this opportunity to come together. And I'm going to read from verse 9. What do workers gain from their toil? I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and to do good while they live. That each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. We all have a job to do. We all have things to do to further the kingdom of God. Monarchs, good or ill, pass. So do we as individuals. But the people persist. What is God good for us? God's will is good for us. God's favour is with his people. And we are his people. What is our toil? It is to spread the gospel, to be an example in our community. Our late Queen was an example in her capacity as monarch. We should be praying that Charles should be able to follow that example. He's got a very high barrier to cross, hasn't he? It's going to be difficult. But our prayers should be with him, that he should be able to fulfill the duties of head of state, as well as his mother did. Finally, remember this. Whatever is, has already been. And what will be, has been before. And God will call the past to account. That's for us, how we have lived our lives when we meet our Maker. That is for monarchs and prime ministers and governments and the members thereof. It is for all of us. God is watching us. God knows all. God sees what's in our hearts. Amen.